Good evening. My name is Jason Wallace. I'm the pastor of Christ Presbyterian Church here in the Salt Lake Valley, and we welcome you to another installment of the Ancient Paths. This past Friday, we had a debate at the University of Utah. I debated Martin Tanner on the subject of Scripture, and hope you were able to attend that. If you weren't, the video, I believe, is up on YouTube, and our website should have audio of that fairly soon. It was a good debate. We're going to be talking about some of the points that were raised in future episodes. But we had something that had come up in the news that we thought would be interesting to engage in conversation over that. But before we move on to that, I'd like to invite you to worship with us. We meet Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. at 8630 West, 2700 South. That's Main Street, Magna. And we meet 5:30 p.m. Sunday nights there as well. We have a mission work in Logan, and there is a group also that is in talks with us about how we might better cooperate together in Ogden. And so if you have any, I'm sorry, getting tongue-tied tonight, but if you have any questions about that, please give us a call. Well, we have with us a couple of guests. We have with us the co-directors of Affirmation. It is a group for gay Latter-day Saints and was part of the protest that took place on Friday night. We have with us Mr. Dwayne Jennings and also Brian Bennington. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Now, the protest that took place Friday night, we're going to have a clip of that in just a moment. That was a protest over the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints participating in the passage of Proposition 8 in California. Yes. That Proposition 8 overturned what the state Supreme Court had ruled in terms of overturning the previous vote, right, and saying that homosexuals have the right to marry in California. The people in California overturned that again, or voted again in favor of that. What was the purpose of the protest?
The purpose of the protest really came out of, I would say, the sorrow of many, and the anger of many of the gay and lesbian, of gays and lesbians, because there are so many families in California, and I'm talking about families that have young children, gays and lesbians who have young children in their families who are not going to have the protections that marriage does, that does offer heterosexual couples. And the domestic partnerships don't give fully the same protections and rights. And so and then the anger coming out of the whole thing, and the protest came out of also the anger with the LDS Church getting involved in the sense that they were able to pull together funds from outside of California and send those into California, which basically the bulk of as far as the coalition is concerned, the bulk of the money that was raised for that came from members of the LDS Church from outside the state of California. So there is some anger over that from Californians, from native Californians, and from people outside, because it's quite possible that Proposition 8 would never have been passed if it had not been for that.
There was another part of it too, though, and that was during the whole campaign. There were a lot of publications and ads that were put on the air that had a lot of half-truths and painted gay people in some very negative ways, and also stretched some of the results that they were saying were going to happen if marriage was allowed for all people. And so some of the anger and the protest was about that as well.
But now there were also contributors from pro-homosexual groups outside
Yes.
of California as well. And there were also ads, I saw one on the internet that basically portrayed LDS missionaries as coming in and trying to figure out what they're going to ban next. You know, there were caricatures on both sides, weren't there?
Yes.
There were.
But
for example, there was a Chinese language advertisement that was put on the air, and it labeled gay and lesbian people as pedophiles, and they said that if this isn't passed, Prop 8, that mothers will be able to marry their sons, and teenagers will be able to marry adults, and that polygamy would be allowed, and the equal marriage rights had none of that in it, and we could go on.
But now, if the concern was that these domestic partnerships, which are allowed in California, correct?
Yes.
If the issue is that these do not provide enough protections for contractual relationships and things like this, why not push for those coverages to be made under domestic partnerships? Why is it that you want to redefine marriage to include people that it has not been historically understood?
Well, I think there's something you have to realize, that there are a lot of families who already have children. And those children, in a sense, are put in a position where they are going to be explaining that they have two fathers, two mothers, and they can't say that their parents are married. It's kind of an awkward thing to say my parents are domestic partners, or and no parent, for instance, who has a son and a daughter who looks forward to son and daughter being married speaks about, I'm looking forward to my son or daughter being civil unioned or domestically partnered. You talk about looking forward to the marriage of a child. It's an event where the community comes together in support of that couple and in honor of that relationship. And I think part of the inequality is just in that terminology itself, where it's making a class of people feel like they're second-class citizens, or at least in the eyes of the public.
But who defines marriage? I mean, from our understanding, marriage is defined by God, and it is one man and one woman. That is the ideal from the beginning. How is it that on what basis should we redefine marriage to accommodate the feelings that, I mean, there are children whose parents are heterosexuals that are not married.
Right.
Well, historically, though, there have been many forms of marriage. There have been, polygamous groups that are talked about all and throughout the Bible, where the patriarchs had many wives and concubines, and historically, in various cultures, you've also found where there have been situations where a woman has had a couple of husbands, and there are cultures that have also celebrated same-sex couples and had ceremonies there. Of course, yes, if you then come down to the Bible, well, the Bible supports marriage between a man and one or more than one woman. And so, but the discussion for, or the push for same-sex or equal marriage rights isn't to make that a plural situation, but that it will be between two consenting, non-related adults. And that is what the argument is about.
On what basis do you argue that this, everyone has some basis for their ethical assertions. Everyone had, I mean, when we talked with the atheist a couple of weeks ago, he had a system of morals and ethics for what he said that his wife should have greater value than a fetus. And we ask, on what basis do you make that moral judgment? My belief is that we have to have a basis. We can't simply assert out of thin air. On what basis do you argue that marriage is wrong? It's wrong to define marriage as the way it has historically been understood, and should be
Well,
defined more broadly.
By whose interpretation is the Bible being defined too? There is that issue. And when in some ways the story in Genesis is a celebration of creation as a whole, you're talking about one man, one woman, but that also brings in the concept of gender, which is the Mormon Church is very specific on that. They believe, of course, in a pre-existence where our spirits existed eternally prior to this earth as sons and daughters of God. Excuse me. And that for them, male and female gender is determined even before you're born or before you go into the womb of the mother. And that's a really questionable thing for me, because we have a whole group of people who are intersex, who are born with neither. Dwayne knows a lot more about this because he's done the scientific research, but they're not specifically male nor female.
Well, there are people
or they're both.
Well, right. there are people who may have. I don't want to get too specific in description. There are people who may have anatomies that demonstrate both, but in terms of chromosomes, they're either XY or XX, correct?
Not always.
Sometimes it's only actually determined as they mature. They may really look to have all the features of the one gender.
I understand, but they're born with either XX or XY.
There are some double X's, and they're actually now finding that there are some people who are a double male, a double female, or a male and a female together in the chromosomes, double chromosomes. So the issue is being understood more and more as science looks into it.
But getting back to what you were talking about.
Before we move on to, I want to flesh some of this out, but you know, I want to qualify for the folks that are watching this evening. This was a very last-minute invitation that was given, and these gentlemen were very gracious to come on short notice, and so we're not going into as much depth as we might otherwise, because, frankly, we've just simply not given them an opportunity to prepare as much as they would normally have done, and so I appreciate you coming on short notice, and we'll try to honor that. But I'd like to look at some of the footage. Now, you didn't organize this, but Affirmation were participants in it.
We were invited to participate, yeah.
Right, and I haven't actually seen much of the video myself, so I'd like to look at some of what's going on and get your feedback, positive or negatively, on that. Now, one of the main themes that we saw in there is that the LDS Church was being accused of hate, and that there was to be a separation of church and state. Now, obviously that was a cross-section of different groups, but Affirmation is actually a group still committed to the basic principles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right? I mean,
Yes, they are.
You believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. You believe that it's through mortal probation you prove your worthiness. I mean, you still hold to these
First,
principles?
Affirmation is a support group for gay, lesbian, bi, transgendered, and intersex Mormons. That's the first thing, a support group. The second is to be bring people together to help educate the larger community of what it is to be gay, lesbian, bi, transgendered, intersex, or Mormon, and Mormon. So that's the main reason. Now, people come into the group with many different experiences within their church. Some question God when they come in. Others still are believing. There are people involved who are still very active in the church, attend the temple, and we have a few who are trying to maintain a heterosexual marriage, but they recognize that they're either lesbian or gay, and they feel like they need that connection and support in trying to figure out how to go forward with that.
And often, you remember when I spoke with you over the phone, I said often in the LDS Church, one of the things that I admired firstly about many of the other denominations, Presbyterian and Methodist, and I had read a number of books, as has Dwayne, where we've noticed how in their communities they've allowed for open discussion between their pastors or ministers and the members of the congregation who might be gay or lesbian or struggling with those issues, some of them in marriages. Whereas often in the LDS faith, everything has just been so shut down that as people are growing up, there's no place to put these questions and have them answered, and a lot of times nobody is skilled in terms of they're not a trained ministry often in terms of psychological counseling, so you often are sent to someone that they recommend, and often they're people who are not, that you're sent to are not, they're not really skilled, I think, at what they do. So Affirmation does present, at least has tried to bridge that gap that there is for many of these people to sit and talk with one another about the experiences and be of help and assistance.
Now, I'm curious because, I mean, there's sort of two issues here. One
Yes.
is the sort of the bigger issue of the protest, which is the LDS Church has what I believe is at least a somewhat biblical understanding of marriage, and I would support them in their understanding that marriage is, at least current understanding, that it's to be between one man and one woman. Why should they be pressed to change?
Well, the protest wasn't so much that the LDS Church changed their actual belief within their church. It wasn't to ask them to start temple marriages. The whole Prop 8 was about civil marriage, and civil marriage has always been where the legal rights come in a marriage, and then a person's church service and celebration is within that congregation, their belief between them and God. And so there are those two issues about marriage. The protest was about the church's involvement, about some of the things that had been said during that period of time, and it was appreciated in the last couple of weeks and over last weekend and Friday, where the church talked about civil dialogue and refraining from erroneous statements, and that's a wonderful thing. Unfortunately, they were part of a coalition that put out a lot of erroneous ideas. And so yes, we would love to promote that more friendly dialogue where people step back from some of the traditional fears and scare tactics or stereotypes, and be able to discuss the issues, and specifically the civil rights issues.
Well, in terms of in terms of their involvement there, obviously it is good to dialogue, but some of what you mentioned, I mean, isn't it true that if the state recognized homosexual unions as equal to heterosexual unions, I mean, aren't we already beginning to see that this is something that is being taught in the schools and that it is becoming an issue where people are charging hate speech for those who say that homosexuality is wrong? I mean, in Saskatchewan, you had a man that was publishing pamphlets that said that homosexual behavior was immoral and unhealthy. And he was fined by the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission $17,500 and forbidden from ever criticizing homosexuality again. I mean, it's not just on marriage. I mean, is it? It is part of a bigger issue. I mean, I don't know what was all said in the advertisements, but it does go beyond just the civil relationship. It goes to what the state views and what is being imposed. I mean, I have concerns that if I preach from Leviticus 18 or 20, that you know, in Canada has been categorized as hate speech and is illegal, and I can be jailed. And I have concerns whether under the incoming administration that hate speech, which was a similar piece of legislation, was actually passed by the House of Representatives about, what, year and a half, 2 years ago. Didn't make it past that, but we may be seeing it all over again.
Yeah, that brings up a couple of issues, and I haven't done the research on the Canada experience, but there is another one that has been used in some of the protect marriage brochures, the anti-gay brochures, and that talking about Sweden. And a minister there had been saying some real outlandish things, and he ended up being, I forget if he was arrested or charges were filed. And of course, what I've read on this side of the ocean, they tried to make it that he was fined and he spent all this time in jail. The truth is that they pressed the charge. He was never, put in jail. It was appealed and found in his favor that it was protected under religious freedom. Now, of course, the United States laws are a little different than Europe and Canada, and there's been a constant debate on that, and different groups have supported different religions, including the ACLU. The ACLU has represented the Mormon Church on several occasions, too, to ensure its constitutional rights as well. So the political situation is a little different when one starts comparing it to Canada or Europe or that.
But in California, with the decision of the court that was actually written into the decision,
Right.
that a person in your position as a minister would be protected, that they would not, that you could hold your position
But
without any punitive action at all.
well, one of the churches, one of the congregations in our denomination, actually had a situation in San Francisco years ago. The city passed a local ordinance that forbade any discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation,
Right.
and churches were not exempted from that. The church had hired an organist and had specifically asked him, are you a practicing homosexual? And he assured them he was not. Shortly, a few months later, he went and told them he had lied to them and he was a practicing homosexual. And they said, well, we cannot have you employed by the congregation living in that way,
Right.
because it is against the standards of our church.
Right.
And I think he was actually fine with it at first, but some friends found out about it and they decided to make a test case out of it. The city's human rights, I forget the exact term of the board, but they brought charges against the church. The church went to court, had to spend many, many hours in court, thousands of dollars in legal fees. Some of this was defrayed through outside giving, but they lost the case.
Right.
They then appealed it to the federal courts, and the federal courts ruled in their favor. The response, and I'm not trying to lump everyone in, but the response was that the church was firebombed.
Right.
This is a serious issue, and
See, I think it should be built into, if civil unions or domestic partnerships, civil marriage, even if you want to call it civil marriage, is allowed, I think it would be better if it were federally mandated that there are certain protections so that those issues don't happen, so that those couples and their children, gay or lesbian couples with their children, do have those protections. Know that the children are and themselves are taken care of, and yet you still have a right as a pastor to disagree with them as to their lifestyle, if you want to put it like that.
Well, but we're talking about more than just two people going in and going through a ceremony and receiving the certificate from the state. I mean, we have gone from the what is it, American Psychiatric Association describing homosexuality as a mental illness to now homophobia is considered one, but homosexuality is not. I mean, are we swinging the pendulum to the other side? That, I mean, what we're seeing is that it is not just tolerance that's being now pushed in many quarters, but you have to affirm people in their positions. We had a young lady that had to quit her job with the University of Utah because they told her whatever someone's belief, and they were particularly thinking of sexual orientation, but they said whatever someone's belief system, you'd have to affirm them in it. It's not enough to tolerate it. And so she actually asked the question, well, what if someone believes that we all evolved from goop and that blonde-haired, blue-eyed people are the highest evolved and should have nothing to do with anyone below them? Should we affirm them in that? The meeting was quickly ended and there was no response. But, you know, I think what we're seeing here is that there is a competition of worldviews, and that each one is going to drive out the other to some degree. I don't think there's a neutrality here, is there?
I think there is, and we can look at a lot of different issues historically where there has been heated debate, whether it's in the United States or Europe or elsewhere. And through the dialogue and the discussion, and sometimes you have to try out the laws and put them in court and review them that way, and that a normalcy can come about through that discussion. And it causes a lot of growing pains. You know, we're still in the United States in this great experiment of democracy. And the Founding Fathers said it was an experiment and that it would be ongoing.
But now one of the problems is that, like in the Romer case, democracy isn't being respected, and then the California Supreme Court, the democratic vote is being overturned by those who believe that they have a system superior to democracy.
Well, the United States was founded with 3 branches of government, and they each have their purposes, and the Founding Fathers saw that there could be occasions when special interest groups or the majority would try to control or take away different people's rights. There was that fear by the landowners that, you know, if you gave people too many rights and you didn't have a check and balance on that, and the judiciary was part of the checks and balances, they can be overruled also. It's part of the reason why they're not voted in, so that they don't have to worry about they're doing the popular thing.
But aren't they specifically defined not to legislate from the bench, but rather to interpret the existing laws and rule within the bounds of our Constitution?
And one could pretty much argue that that's exactly what the California court did. They'd also been given, well, the governor and the legislature had passed several different pieces as well that would give, same-sex couples civil unions or domestic partnerships. It was an incremental thing, but the court has very often ruled that pieces of legislation have been unconstitutional. Different acts by Congress and the president have been ruled on occasion as being unconstitutional and have had to be taken off of the books.
Yeah, the problem is when they make that assertion but without any basis in the Constitution. Mm-hmm. I mean, for 187 years, there was never understood to be a right to an abortion, but in 1973, all of a sudden the court found one that no one had ever seen before. And without the benefit of any new legislation, they said that what had been accepted for 187 years was wrong. And anyway,
well, I'm not an American, and you know that. So I can only draw from my own experience, and the California experience is similar in some aspects. But I come from a country where the majority of the people were under the rule of a small group of whites. And growing up in my country, it was like growing up in the South back prior to the 60s and the Civil Rights Movement, really. When South Africa changed, became a democratic nation, once they were moving towards that, they looked at one class of people that were the last class for them to consider, which was the gays, people who professed to be gay or lesbian. And they looked at the rights of that group of people and said, here is another group of people who we could deny certain rights under our rule of law to. But because of our prior experience with exclusion, we are not going to do the same with this class of people. And out of that, later on, came the South African civil marriage law, which allows equality of marriage for all people, whether you're gay, lesbian, black, white, whatever.
One of the frustrating things in a conversation like this is that we're going to run out of time before we have a chance to really deal much. So I want to deal with the biblical aspects a little bit, but we're going to go ahead and open up the phone lines here, and then keep talking. But if you'd like to join in the conversation, we invite you to call in. It's 973-TV20, 973-8820. The question I have for you is, they were chanting separation of church and state. Right. Do you believe that churches have a right to engage in subjects of morality in the public square?
Yeah, churches, like businesses and schools and the general population, have that right. Okay, and so all of us together make up the public discussion and how a democracy works and functions and protects everyone.
And so you would disagree with the people that were saying that a church should have nothing to do with these things. You may disagree with their stance or something like that, but you would agree that a church can participate in the political...
Well, the LDS Church were fully within their rights, as were the rest of the coalition. Absolutely.
That's a comfort in our day, actually. That you
but when it starts taking away people's rights, that's when it becomes a problem. And so thus, I think people were, yelling, separation of church and state. When it comes to the law, of course, in the discussion, the debate, no, everyone should have the right to say what they would like to say and have that be respected.
Now, you're coming from a different perspective than some of these other folks, and you're coming from a different perspective than I am. I'm curious, as people who take seriously the faith of Latter-day Saints, and yet how do you how do you understand yourself as Latter-day Saints who are not submitting to the prophet's declarations?
Well, there are a couple of ways of answering that one.
Because I mean, it's one thing. It's like me saying that. I mean, that I'm a Presbyterian, but I don't believe the Bible, which actually some people do in the mainline denomination.
Right.
But better example. How can someone claim to be a Catholic, but deny the some of the essential doctrines of that church? How can they? I mean, it seems as if either you submit to their definition or you go somewhere else.
There are several ways of answering that. And at least in my being raised in the LDS Church, foremost thing was to put your faith in God, to have an active relationship, reading the Scriptures, prayer and meditation, search all things, hold fast to that which is good. And for my own case, that I was when I started really understanding that my orientation wasn't changing, I was like, well, then what do I do? And that took a couple of years of toiling and knocking and on the door and prayers and that. But I believe, and I guess my answer is that God's the ultimate authority, and that we're each called to have that personal relationship and witness. And we're all here struggling and trying to do our best, and I believe most churches are trying to do their best as well and help people the best they can, but we are all human.
I'm curious, it's difficult to talk to people that you haven't really met before and tread easily on things that are of the deepest value to them, and be careful not to offend. But a friend of mine was raised LDS, did his mission, married in the temple, but began to be tempted towards homosexuality and pursued that for some time. For him, that was, he found that there was no freedom from sin. There were all these different things that didn't deal with what he was convinced was sinful, and I think rightfully so. He found a moralism, but he didn't find true deliverance. That led him out of that and led him to read the Bible in a new light, outside of the Mormon paradigm. And what he found there was that it wasn't just that he was broken. We're all broken. We're all sinful. We're all tempted to a variety of different things. And that what he needed was not a plan of salvation or some coping mechanism, but what he needed was a new heart. And by God's grace, he found that.
Can I try and answer that?
Go ahead.
And then Dwayne, help me out here, because I may not say exactly what I want to. A lot of people, when they're coming to terms with the issue of homosexuality, initially when they leave any of the faiths, whether it be a Mormon faith or one of the Christian denominations, there's that period of trying to find out who they are, and often they're pulled into a world much like many heterosexuals are of hedonism, where your whole focus is on the parties you go to, the people that you meet, the sex, the drugs, all that kind of stuff. And then they realize, just like many straight people, that that's not where it really is at. And for me, the issue is that you can be moral as a homosexual person, whether you're gay or lesbian, just as we don't choose our sexuality, just as you did not choose to be attracted to your wife, for instance. It's just all too young woman when you're younger. It's just something that kind of unfolds. And I feel that there is a place in God's plan somewhere for people who are gay or lesbian, that they don't have to. There is no, as the Mormons have always taught among their people, they say that we hold to a single standard of morality for whether you're single or whether you're or married. And I think that can, if given, let's say, civil marriage does come in, what you're doing is you're holding, in a sense, gays and lesbians to be accountable to a higher moral standard. You're saying here is the opportunity for you to blend your lives together, but you have to live on this by the same standard we expect married couples in general to live, which means faithfulness to one another throughout life. So you're living a Christian standard as best as you know, given the parameters you have. You didn't choose to be gay or lesbian, but you're choosing that to get as close as you can to those parameters as you can.
We don't have time to deal with this in the depth I would love to, and it would not be fair to go into in a huge amount of depth with me springing this interview on you at the last minute. But you made the assertion that you can be a moral person engaging in these things, but I believe that the Bible is clear that it is immoral, that we may have desires for certain things. I may have a desire for a woman other than my wife. I may have a desire for someone that is inappropriate. I want to be careful how we articulate this, but you know, the Bible says that we are sinners and we are tempted to things that are not good. Right. I deal with people all the time that are married, that marriage is not the riding off into the sunset the way that they envision. They find out they're a sinner. Or, well, they find out they're married to a sinner. They may not find out they're a sinner. Right. Their spouse knows they're married to a sinner. But what happens is there are temptations to behavior that is contrary to God's Word. Now, it's one thing to be tempted in that. It's another thing to follow through on that. And
well, here's a question, and I'm cutting you off a little bit.
Bear with me for a moment. I want to try to squeeze in some phone calls, but Leviticus 18 and 20 says that it is an abomination for a man to lie with a man as with a woman. In the New Testament, we have Romans 1, where basically you have a description of the Gentile world, that the two things that they were typically known for among Jews was that they were idolaters and Greek love, as it was known, homosexual practice. And that homosexual behavior is described as a judgment for their idolatry, for their suppressing of the truth. And you have 1 Corinthians 6, where a number of different things are listed as inconsistent with having a changed heart. Now, unfortunately, many fundamentalists ignore the rest of the list, things like covetousness, adulterers, thieves, but it uses two different terms for homosexual practice, because, not to get too graphic, but in the ancient world there was a lower view of the passive person, as opposed to the active, and so you had pederasty and things like this taking place. But over and over, you have the Bible clearly saying this is immoral. On what basis do you say, but yet it is moral?
Well, you go ahead and answer, but I was just going to mention that there is the issue. I think sexual orientation here is a very definite issue. I don't think that for instance, as a young man growing up in the LDS Church, we were told not to think lustfully, especially towards women. Well, what does that mean specifically? And then where is the line between being attracted to a person? Obviously, you're supposed to have sexual attractions to the opposite sex, and that being a wrong thing. I think the same thing, you did not ask to be sexually attracted to a young woman, it just happened. Many of us did not ask to be sexually attracted to our own sex, that just happened. we didn't all act on that, or necessarily act on that, just as when prior to your marriage you may not have acted on that because you're trying to stay chaste as well. So I think sexual orientation and what that means and if that's a real thing is a big question here. But I think he's got some answers on the scriptural part.
If you hold the thought for 1 second.
Yeah.
My wife is watching this, so this is a what if. My wife is a very gracious, patient person. She's
Right.
been married to me for 16 years.
Right.
That's worth many brownie points if you knew me better. But assume for a moment that I get frustrated with my wife.
Yes.
And all of a sudden I'm tempted towards some other woman.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing to say, well, that's I've heard people make the argument.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I have that desire, but to act on that is contrary to God's word. Even if through my irresponsibility, through my behavior, through her behavior, our love has grown cold, I'm still commanded.
But I'm talking about the attraction itself. The attraction itself
I understand
is
that.
there. It's a natural.
But the
occurring
attraction,
thing.
I may have an attraction for another woman, but I can't give in to that attraction because that is, according to 1 Corinthians 6, out of accord with God's word
Mm-hmm.
and His commandments as my Creator, as the one to whom I owe everything. And it's not the good way. If I did give in to that,
So
I
why
I would bring destruction on
Right.
myself and my family and society.
Yeah.
But anyway,
He probably has.
The Bible brings up so many issues, and if you look at the Bible, there are a number of worldviews in it that we completely reject nowadays, such as slavery. The Leviticus 18 and 20 passage.
I don't like gratuitous assertions. Do you agree that someone can own the time and labor of another person?
Let's not get into that.
Okay, so let's not make the gratuitous assertion.
Right.
Go ahead, Sue.
But you know, to really get to understand the Bible, I think you need to really start looking at some of the language. And there have been assertions made over the years based on some interesting translations. But the Hebrew word that's been translated to the King James as abomination is the term toiva, which is usually used for uncleanness, impurity, taboo.
It's used for bestiality and things like that.
Right, which is also considered unclean. And I was going to make a Mormon comparison. Toiva would be like the word of wisdom, or the kosher laws, which...
Where are shellfish ever called toava, though? Or, I mean, there are these things, but in Leviticus 18 and 20, we have these in the middle of prohibitions against incest, against these other things. So, I mean,
but the Old
they're not called
Testament
toava.
has another word that they use, and it's zina, or zima. I need my glasses. Zima, which is something that's morally wrong, such as murder or robbery. And so there's that one could look at. Many scholars have gone back and looked at the New Testament passages, and you mentioned pederasty, and in all of the situations, Romans they feel is referring more to some of the cultic pagan practices that included sex, which included some homosexual activity. Corinthians and Timothy looks more to be either prostitution or pederasty. And so a lot of these scholars have looked at that and said, okay, let's put this in the context of the prohibitions on heterosexuals. And it has pretty much come down to, well, the abusive, non-respectful sex acts, that's what God has condemned, but a loving relationship between two consenting adults isn't. Now,
I didn't give you a lot of warning for this. What I would point people towards is Robert Gagnon, I think is
Gagnon, yes, I'm aware
his
of him.
book, The Bible and Homosexual Practice.
Right.
And I think he does thorough refutations of Boswell and others. We only have a few minutes left. I want to try to get in a couple of phone calls. I apologize for the wait. We have Matt with us from Ogden.
Hi, yes. I was wondering, you kind of already started this as I called in, but if you could just deal more with as a Christian, coming to this question, it all hangs on biblical authority. I was wondering if you could deal with the interpretations that you had already brought up, 1 Corinthians 6, 1 Timothy, Romans, as well as those in Leviticus, and really kind of flesh these things out. And let's talk about whether or not these passages are as unclear as some make them out to be. And I'll go ahead and hang up now and just listen. Thanks.
Thanks. If I can just give some feedback, and I think, and I would actually love to have you back. I don't know if y'all are going to be chomping at the bit to come back, but I would hope. I think that it's like in some of the discussions that we've had with Latter-day Saints. There are assertions about the text being unclear, about the interpretation, things like this. But when we go back, we find that this is not some novel interpretation that we hold to. It's something that has been argued through the early church fathers, through the Middle Ages, through the Reformation. Do you believe that someone like Boswell has really stumbled onto something radically different?
Well, there are many scholars. One is Peter Noem, who addresses these issues.
Peter Gomez.
Gomez, and
There's Helmy there.
Michael Jordan, not the basketball player. It's Jordan, isn't it, or is it Jordan? Anyway, I've read so many books.
But I mean, do they have any? There's this revisionist history that has come about. We see the new, radically different hermeneutics, where people say that they're bringing in a deconstructionism. They're trying to get rid of the patriarchalism and this and that and the other. It's not a legitimate hermeneutic, but it's something that they're imposing on the text and can make the text really say anything they want. I mean, is there...
Right, and you can do that with translation to some degree, but but you can look at how words were used at the period of time, and a lot of these scholars have very meticulously tried to do that and understand what is actually being said, and it's good to have some of the different ideas. And Gagnon is someone who has some interesting things to say, and he takes some of these other scholars that disagree with him, and he looks at them. I do, however, believe that he has it based on a worldview that is incomplete.
Well, I would disagree, and I think that the others are bringing their worldview in as well. We're trying to squeeze in a few things real quick here, but let me ask you this. Do you believe the Bible is clear in its prohibitions on incest?
Yes.
And do you believe that that's a moral issue, or do you believe that that's a cultic ceremonial issue?
We know it was done both ways.
And so you would believe that it's forbidden in both contexts.
Right.
And it's in the same section of Leviticus as the prohibition on homosexual behavior.
Yes, but like I said, there's a lot of stuff.
I found a really interesting thing that in doing the research for his book that he's been working on, and it comes from an Orthodox Jewish rabbi, and he talks about how the rabbis through the centuries have had these discussions about Leviticus and the books of the Bible, and how in every new generation, in the sense they have to look at that and say, does what was said then mean the same thing for our generation? And he says, I'll just read this really quickly because I know we don't have time. He says, talking of the case where they would talk about stoning a rebellious or stubborn son in a particular time, the sages who looked at the Talmud looked at the written Torah in much the same way as modern American jurisprudence looked at the American Constitution, which some people hold to also be a sacred document. And then he says the sages of the Talmud operate in much the same manner as do the American Supreme Court justices. They determine, based upon the needs of their own time, the rules of the ancient law that are still mandatory upon the Jewish people in their own time period, and their rulings operate in the same manner as do the amendments to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. He says, the purpose, and he continues, the purpose of the revelation is to bring ancient law into modern practice, so in other words, to bring the people into balance with the will of God. This does not mean that they ignore or negate the original text. They still continue to argue the issues using the text in, and he's got some word there I don't know, in later examples, but they do not use the text to carry out the sentence of judgment of stoning these disobedient children. And he said the rabbis have played, he said what we think of in terms of Leviticus and what it says about homosexuality is not the way that they see it in their judgment.
Well,
Anyway.
I feel I've done an injustice to the subject in trying to squeeze all this into a short period. I would invite both of you to come back and discuss this further, and really appreciate you being with us. I apologize. We had some callers that we simply ran out of time. If you are still holding, we'll try to get to you after we go off the air. We appreciate you being with us. We have had with us Dwayne Jennings and Brian Bennington. I apologize. They are co-directors of Affirmation. We'll be back next week, and we hope you'll be able to worship with us soon. We meet Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. at 8630 West, 2700 South. We meet 5:30 p.m. for evening worship, and we have a mission work in Logan. If you'd like more information, please check out our website, and hope to see you next week. Until next time, we wish you the Lord's blessings. Good night.